You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
How you doing, Prashant?
Good, how you doing?
Doing well. We took a bit of a break on the podcast because of a few technical malfunctions, but it's good to be back. A lot's happened in the meantime, I guess. I should note that before we did this recording today, we actually heard some signs that President Trump is now reconsidering joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We'll see where that goes. I think there's a few obstacles, to say the least, of before the United States could rejoin that pact. But also a few things have happened in the meantime, just, I guess, professionally with me. So I actually spent a little time in D.C. last week. Unfortunately, I couldn't run into you, Prashant, but I spent some time on the Hill actually testifying before the U.S.-China Security and Economic Review Commission on the topic of China's views of U.S. alliances. And the hearing was actually, it was a good hearing with a lot of great questions, but there was a lot that was in my written submitted testimony that I couldn't really fully get to discuss. So I thought maybe, Prashant, we could take this podcast today and talk a bit about China's views of U.S. alliances in the Asia Pacific, something we've talked about before, but maybe we can drill in a bit specifically on the issue of Chinese Communist Party attempts to pursue covert influence in U.S. aligned democracies. And the two big examples that I think have gotten a lot of really good coverage in the Western press have been the cases in Australia and New Zealand. And I'll just briefly go over the developments there. Maybe we can talk a bit about other regions in Asia as well, and sort of how this factors into China's strategy as it pursues its great rejuvenation and emerges as a power in its own right in Asia. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, let's get right into it then. So real briefly, I'll just go over the two big cases in Australia and New Zealand. So actually, I think New Zealand is probably the more interesting case to start with. And here, the work that we primarily rely on is the work done by Anne-Marie Brady, whose reporting has really showed how the Chinese Communist Party has worked effectively to place a variety of pro-China individuals in New Zealand, both within the ethnic Chinese community there and outside, across the New Zealand government, within New Zealand politics. And Brady further has shown in her reporting that these strategies that the Chinese Communist Party has deployed there have actually had some impact on New Zealand's foreign policy towards China. She calls this, sort of New Zealand's new no surprises policy towards China, and that if there are any disputes or points of disagreement, that New Zealand would take this up behind the scenes with China instead of making it more of a public issue. And obviously, I think with New Zealand, the level of influence is concerning. And actually, at my hearing, Peter Mattis, who does a lot of work on this, actually brought up the point of New Zealand's participation in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement with Australia, the UK, the United States, and Canada. And if there's concern that certain Five Eyes briefing materials might be making it into the hands of certain people with access to this intelligence, that could potentially compromise operations. And then in Australia, I think I think this actually got better coverage in the United States at least, but certainly it was a huge issue in Australia, was the incident surrounding a former senator from the Labour Party last year, Sam Dastyari, who ended up resigning after a series of revelations showed that he'd received a variety of financial favors from Chinese Communist Party linked interests. And especially after a video came out showing him giving a speech basically parroting China's position on the South China Sea disputes last year. So all of this is really, stirred up concern in the United States, where, there's also some work going on. Bethany Allen Ibrahimian at Foreign Policy Magazine is doing a lot of good work on this in the U.S. context, looking especially at the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations on U.S. campuses and their often nuanced relationships with the Chinese embassies and consulates in this country, and how that sort of translates to CCP influence. This is really it's an understudied area, but I think more and more it's starting to become a topic of greater importance. But Prashant, when you look at the cases in Australia and New Zealand, the question I have is how well can China really reproduce this in other Asian or other states in the Asia Pacific? Because I think, Australia and New Zealand both are English-speaking democratic states aligned with the United States with significant Chinese diasporas in each case. Obviously, we see similarities in Southeast Asia, for example, but really I think the ways in which Chinese influence works in Southeast Asia is a little bit different. Do you want to comment a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's an excellent way to frame it because I think the way that Chinese influence operations get discussed in the United States is often well, I guess there's two kind of major streams, right? One is the sort of, how does this affect US allies and partners? And the other one is, we've gotten a bit from Peter Mattis and others, what's the distinction between what the Russians are doing and what the Chinese are doing, right? Which are kind of the two big stories that are going on. But I think the question that you pose is interesting, which is, how do we compare this across cases? And you can think about it in a couple of ways. One is, I mean, what kind of state are we talking about? As you hinted at in the question, there are these U.S. allies and partners that are thinking along the same lines about the United States in terms of, how to combat and how to manage these influence operations. But there are also other countries like, Cambodia is a good example, Philippines is another one, where these countries are actually falling victim to these operations. And at times, these influence operations, they're being perpetrated or furthered by interests, whether it's business interests or academic interests or others, that are actually, willing to participate in these influence operations and are actually tools of these influence. So I guess that's one question, which is what is the orientation of the state in question? And the other one is, I mean, what kind of vulnerabilities exist in these countries, right? So the Australian case is notable because it sort of unveiled a lot of vulnerabilities that were in the Australian political system that, you sort of wonder, I mean, why were those things there, right? In terms of, the ability of, foreign agents to influence and fund political parties and their operations. That's kind of what led to the case that you referenced earlier, right? So there are these innate vulnerabilities in these countries that existed before, and China and its influence operations have kind of brought to the fore these weaknesses and vulnerabilities that have existed. And I think that's kind of where we're at in the United States now. I mean, we've been talking about, influence operations by the Chinese for years. And there have been lists going around about organizations that are funded by the Chinese, that are funded by associations that need to be worried about. But the interesting question is, from the US context, why is this only taking place now? I mean, this is something that's been talked about for a long time, and I think you can point to several things. I mean, one is, that there's increasing concern about Chinese behavior more generally, right? And influence operations is part of that. But I think the other part of this is you are seeing a hardening response to Chinese activities in this regard, right? And this is coinciding with a lot of other trends, including what the Trump administration is doing in terms of great power competition with China. So there's a lot of angles here that are coming together that I think has, as you pointed out, elevated this debate, which I think still remains quite understudied. I mean, even if you look in the literature for a basic definition of Chinese influence operations, it's very difficult to actually find that. And I think, those distinctions and definitions are important when we're talking about this because, you correctly hinted at in your original analysis, the Chinese are doing a lot of traditional things that other countries do as well. But there are things that they're doing that are very different and worrying, and we should be careful to distinguish between those two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the newness and how understudied this is are absolutely points well taken. It was something that I emphasized again in my testimony. I was actually asked to speak about the examples of South Korea and Japan, and actually I think those examples are good examples of where we see kind of the traditional tools of statecraft being used towards coercive ends, right? I mean, so both of these, some people have called this an example of China's sharp power, quote unquote. I mean, the end goal of this kind of covert influence operation is still ultimately to influence the recipient country's foreign policy on issues of Chinese core national interests, right? So in the Samdastiari case, the issue at the center of it was Australia's a domestic debate about its own South China Sea policy, with New Zealand similarly about how New Zealand would take up bilateral issues with China. In the South Korean case, a big case study that I looked at was the coercive episode over THAAD, which we've talked a bit about on this podcast before. And some listeners may know that in October 2017, the dispute effectively reached a resolution when China and South Korea made a joint declaration via their foreign ministries that they'd come to an understanding, and South Korea emphasized its so-called three no's, where it gave China assurances on the kinds of behavior it would agree to carry out or not carry out within the contours of its alliance with the United States. So I find that to be quite concerning. I mean, I think some analysts took that episode as a sign of China losing the dispute over THAAD, right? I mean, China had made this whole stink about the U.S. deploying a missile defense system, and eventually it caved. The THAAD launchers still sit there in South Korea. But to
Hmm.
end the dispute, I mean, South Korea had to say that they wouldn't accept any new THAAD launchers, any new missile defense deployments, and they would never join a trilateral alliance with Japan. The trilateral alliance point is an older South Korean point, but the first two I think I find concerning within the context of the alliance. Japan, I think, is again another interesting case because with Japan, I think you sort of get into these identity and history issues that make any kind of that I think really limit the level of outreach that that the Chinese Communist Party can really undertake. Even something like the Japan Communist Party. I mean, one of the factors that I noticed in my research was that the Chinese Communist Party has historically reached out to far left parties or communist parties in various Asian states to build kind of party to party solidarity. But in Japan, again, this hasn't been a successful vector, right? I mean, the Japan Communist Party, while it's a communist party in name, I mean, still doesn't budge on issues like Japan's territorial claims in the East China Sea or anything like that. So they still have divergences there. But there are a few interesting episodes. I mean, Okinawa is a major point of contention between the two countries. Although China
Hmm.
hasn't officially come out and contested Japanese sovereignty over the Ryukyu chain and Okinawa, semi-authoritative sources in the Chinese state media have sort of questioned this. But also the Japan Public Security Intelligence Agency in December 2016 came out and said that Communist Party linked sort of academic groups and universities were carrying out exchanges with Okinawan separatist academics. So they were trying to keep this discourse alive in Okinawa. And it's a very real discourse, right? I mean, China didn't manufacture Okinawan grievances about the U.S. military presence, but it's trying to stoke this in order to break U.S. alliances in the region. And I think that's really what this all comes down to. This whole conversation about Chinese influence is about China's views of the old-fashioned nature, I guess, of U.S. alliances, right? We heard this in Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent speech earlier this week at the Boao Forum for Asia, where we heard the usual boilerplate Chinese language on zero-sum mentality and Cold War relics of these alliances. China really sees, I think, China recognizes that U.S. alliances are an asymmetric advantage. China has one treaty ally in Asia, and that's North Korea, not a particularly
Hmm.
useful ally in rising as a great power. Meanwhile, the United States has many. It has allies, partners, and this is kind of the main scenario that I think China feels the need to significantly erode if it's going to exert the kind of influence that it wishes to on the regional order. But before we move on to that, do you want to talk a bit about the Southeast Asian cases a little more in detail and your observations there? I mean, what are the ways in which China primarily coerces and wins hearts and minds to influence policy in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think your examples there on South Korea and Japan really hit on, the key point here. How do we distinguish between the various mechanisms that the Chinese use, right? So one of the things that scholars have been paying attention to regarding what the Chinese have been doing with respect to Japan, for example, is, how they use historical narratives and Japan's, role in terms of its, the sort of wartime role and the atrocities in order to paint this image of Japan as kind of a militaristic power. And they use all kinds of tools, including media and, other sort of state-directed netizens and things like that in order to perpetrate this image that then undercuts, sort of the U.S.-Japan alliance indirectly. But, other countries do this in different ways too. They do this in a less state-directed way. They do this probably less successfully. And then that's why I think, it really is a very important task for us to distinguish what's going on, what the Chinese are doing versus what other countries are doing. And I think a lot of that is related to the character of the regime, but it's also the types of behaviors we're talking about, right? So to segue into the Southeast Asian cases, you know, after the missing Malaysian plane MH370, the Malaysian government was extremely surprised by how sort of this fierce, virulent Chinese nationalist upsurge very quickly surfaced within, a day or two of the incident that was directed against the Malaysian government, and they made sort of their protest clear about what was going on. But essentially, what the Chinese were trying to do was to very quickly react and paint the blame on the Malaysians and try to affect the Malaysian government's handling of the case. So that is a case where it's not directed at a strict U.S. ally. It's not directed at a foreign policy issue, but it's directed at a issue in the bilateral relationship that was very sensitive for Malaysia domestically. And the other one is, I think the Philippines is a very sort of prominent case now with the increasing extent of Chinese penetration into the country, right? So there's been and again, you have to be very careful when you're talking about influence operations, because there are all these lists and stories that come out that sort of purport to create links between the Chinese versus Chinese government individuals versus Chinese government linked individuals that try to undermine certain governments and institutions. But essentially, the big picture in the Philippines is that certain academic organizations and think tanks and businesses have been seen as complicit in this sort of Duterte charm offensive directed against China. And the allegation has been made that, oh, well, this must be a state directed campaign by the Chinese. Again, when we see these cases, we have to ask the question, to what extent is China pushing on an open door here, right?
Right.
Because in the Philippines, President Duterte has been very forward-leaning in terms of some of the things that he's been doing, and a lot of the links that the Chinese are capitalizing on, they're not new. I mean, they have been building this network of influence in Southeast Asian countries and other countries for years. I think it's just bearing fruit now in an increasing way, and I think we're a number of these countries are waking up to that right now. So I think that's kind of the other thing I would encourage listeners to think about, and scholars who are working on this think about, because I think in the United States, for example, there are all these lists that have gone out about certain Chinese government or government related institutions that are funding think tanks, and then or universities, and then those universities and think tanks have responded in turn saying, well, this doesn't influence our research, or it does influence our research. And I think the big thing comes down to um, you know these organizations, essentially, if they're not to be agents of Chinese influence operations, they ultimately have to turn down certain kinds of funding. And that gets to a whole nother issue about,
Hmm.
you know, where's the funding coming from, and where else would they get the funding if not from China, right? Like some of these institutions, they're getting this, that it's not ideal, but they're getting it because they can't get it from anywhere else. So there is that broader debate here about how the United States and other countries are funding their academic institutions and their think tanks. And the more that that issue is addressed, I think that's a point of vulnerability that can definitely be sort of strengthened. So.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of really good points, and especially I think some of the analytic cautions you raised are really apt in kind of studying this. So if anybody's listening to this that's interested in this topic and working on it, I mean, these are actually really useful points to remain cognizant of. I mean, one of the things we also haven't talked about is making sure that we always differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party and sort of ethnic Chinese, and that's been a big issue in this debate, especially in some of the coverage you see domestically in tabloids and other places like that in Australia and New Zealand. There's all sorts of writing that goes on, just kind of skeptical, almost kind of getting to the point of McCarthyism in some cases, of just certain if you're ethnically Chinese living in these countries and you happen to voice an opinion about some of these issues, you will be regarded with a certain degree of skepticism, and that's the unfortunate truth with all this. And the party's, attempts to seek influence abroad have really created this toxic debate, and that's led to self-censorship in many cases for members of the Chinese diaspora in these countries. So that's kind of one point of analytic caution, is really making sure that we clarify who these agents are. Are they directly members of the CCP? Are they CCP linked agents who are Chinese? Are they sort of non-ethnic Chinese agents living in Australia, New Zealand, other countries in the region who are simply working with these parties. So that kind of clarity, I think, is really necessary. But the
Hmm.
other thing you noted about pushing on an open door, I think, is really apt. I think sometimes, at least it seems to be more of an issue in the United States, maybe with people who don't necessarily travel or spend a lot of time in the region, is that there are people perceive China and what China has to give to a lot of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, is what I'm thinking of here, positively. I mean, they see China as a source of capital, as a source of development. That's even true to an extent in South Asia, in parts of the country. Obviously, I think that's changing a bit with the Belt and Road, and depending on how heavy-handed China's getting in some sectors. But yeah, I mean, I think there's generally a lot of good faith pro-China sentiment in a lot of places. I don't think that's necessarily true in a place like Japan, but certainly elsewhere in the region, that's very true. And in terms of what the United States can do, I think the traditional statecraft cases are a little bit easier to deal with, right? I mean, the THAAD
Hmm.
issue was I think a really interesting case and a missed opportunity, primarily I think because of the Trump administration's general outlook. I mean, South Korea tried to use the WTO as a venue by which to protest China's tariffs, which violate WTO norms and obligations. That didn't really go anywhere, and that's probably partly to do with the fact that the WTO is simply really kneecapped as an organization, and that's not looking better at all. So I mean, when the U.S. talks about the value of a rules-based order, in part it's also to prevent China from being able to economically coerce all of these U.S. partner states and allies in the Asia Pacific. But yeah, I think I think I mean, going forward, this is really going to be a pernicious problem. I don't think this
Yeah.
is going anywhere in the next decades. I mean, as Xi Jinping said at the 19th Party Congress last year when presenting his work report, I mean, China's national rejuvenation project is well underway, and it won't be derailed by any kinds of the kind of pushback we're seeing right now. But I think
Yep.
understanding how the CCP tries to pursue influence covertly and overtly will be more and more important.
Yeah, and I think, just to add on that, sort of note an analytic caution. I mean, it's important to caution that, this can, the overreaction can go the other way too, right? Like in the Australia debate, for example, we've seen folks who've raised concerns about Chinese influence operations being portrayed as, racist, and, bringing up the ethnic Chinese point when these individuals have been very careful to specify in their work
Hmm.
and in their arguments that these are Chinese government directed initiatives, and that's what they're talking about. So I mean, that's one angle, but also if you look at some of these cases, the more complex ones, the line between being ethnic Chinese and being Chinese government linked is actually not that clear, right? So the Singaporeans, when they expelled a Chinese academic recently, for sort of being a foreign agent and encouraging engaging in behaviors that were seen to threaten the national interest, a lot of Singaporean media outlets carried it as the fact that this is another example of how the Chinese are trying to exploit Singapore as being a majority Chinese state. So the role of ethnic Chinese in these countries is something that I think has come to the fore with these influence operations. Because, let's not forget, right, when the Chinese initially started doing these influence operations, there were two parts to it. One was the US allies and partner stuff that we've talked about, but it's also, I mean, they're trying to influence the diaspora internationally too, right? Like they're looking at human rights and democracy activists with respect to Tibet, with respect to Taiwan, and they're trying to look at how can they influence Chinese students at universities to kind of promote the Chinese agenda. So there's kind of two parts to that equation, and that blurs the issue again about the distinction between ethnic Chinese and sort of Chinese government related actors. So it is a complex issue.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is complex. It's messy. It's poorly understood, understudied. We have sort of case studies in a lot of these countries, but I think putting together a sort of generalized model of how the CCP is really going to operationalize this, and really, I mean, is this where our energies are best spent, even in terms of this the great understanding the great power competition that's really going to play out in Asia.
Mhm.
So I think this is something certainly that's really popular right now, right? I think the fact that there was a hearing on the Hill really speaks to that. So I think in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Japan to a lesser extent, but I think it's getting there. these countries will be thinking seriously about the issue of covert Chinese influence. But I think we'll leave it there for this week, Prashant. What do you think?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me as usual.
Good to be with you.
Great. For listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast and you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. And if you're a subscriber but you haven't left us a rating, please do so on either iTunes or Google Play. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.